Hello, viewers. Tonight, I'm going to be doing something somewhat different. This particular video is going to have to do with culture. Oftentimes I do talk about implications, particular symbolic and other such implications in media, but now I'm going to talk more or less about real-world societal culture, which I think I may do more often. Now, usually I will talk about things that I'm interested in, or things that many people do not have a very good understanding of, or do not know very much about. These are going to be more or less basic podcasts. I'm in a situation now where my internet is down for a time, and so this video may not come out until later on. It seemeth to be a problem with the modem or something of that sort. Anyhow, racism in Japan is the subject tonight, because it has something to do with a particular individual who I've done one video about, an individual who is a self-proclaimed Japanese patriot, a nationalist, a person who is part of the Shinto nationalistic movement, which many people do not understand. Because she happeneth to be a proponent of what is known as blackface, a particularly demeaning form of art and media and entertainment that, believe it or not, was known about by Asian peoples and was introduced to them. You know, many years ago, minstrel shows started in America. Blackface was popularized in America. We're going to learn some more about racism in Japan so that I can inform some of you about at least a little regarding the state of racial relations and the dynamic in that country, so that when I do the video about Yoko Ishii, some of you may or may not have some context. Maybe this will be beneficial. Anyhow, without further ado, I'm going to be reading this and giving commentary. I have noticed that I don't particularly like to do reading straight through, so I give commentary throughout. So this is Racism in Japan, a conversation with Anthropology Professor John G. Russell by Tracy Jones. This is from Tokyo Weekender, which I did not know very much about this particular publication. I downloaded it as a PDF file, which, of course, I had to, I'm glad that I did that, because now I have internet problems for the time being, and so because I downloaded it as a PDF file, I can read it, even though I do not have internet access at this moment. So in the early 80s, Anthropology, which is the science of human beings, especially the study of human beings and their ancestors through time and space, and in relation to physical character, environment, and social relations and culture. So in this case, his study has to do with culture, obviously. So in the early 80s, Harlem native John G. Russell was at a Tokyo psychiatric ward visiting the ward's patients as an anthropology and grad student at the time, while among them, a different kind of psychosis emerged. Japan's version of blackface appeared on Japanese TV. Believe it or not, people, it is very popular in Japan. Blackface is very popular in Japan. And there are some people who quite like it, and they're quite proud of that culture. One of those people is an individual who I have done a video about on this channel, named Yoko Ishii. Very interesting. Very interesting video I did about her, and I plan to do more reviewing yet another one of her songs that she did about, the song that I want to review is about Korean comfort women, which Yoko Ishii maketh a mockery of it. Please forgive me if I try to practice at times my early modern English suffixes, eth instead of s. Some of you peradventure do not know what I'm talking about. But at times I try to do that so I can get in the habit of it. Which may seem strange, but anyhow. Let me get back to the subject at hand. What is this? He asked, struck by the strange black figures on the screen. Russell was familiar with Japan's literary portrayal of black people, but since he didn't have a TV at his Tokyo home, this was the first time that he had seen blackface on Japanese TV. After returning to the States to finish his PhD at Harvard University, Russell became keenly attentive toward the presence of Japanese politicians in American media. Let me see, what time? That was the 80s. That was during the 80s. That is very interesting. Almost every year you had a Japanese politician saying something nasty about black folks, he says. The various racist statements that Russell cited were like American zombies crawling out of shallow graves. Nakasone puts foot in melting pot, read a 1986 Chicago Tribune headline. During a televised Liberal Democratic Party meeting, then Prime Minister Nagasone Yasuhiro said, "Since there are black people, Puerto Ricans, and Mexicans in the United States, its level of intelligence is lower on the average." He cited Japan's supposed homogeneous population as an advantage over the West, describing Japan as a high-level information society. Now this is very interesting. Now, whoever wrote this article knows that this is not true. Supposed homogeneous population, that is not true, because among the people in Japan, there are different groups. Okinawans is a different sort of ethnic and even racial group. You have Ainu people. You have Korean people who live in Japan, who have been immigrating there years before. Anyone who knows the reality of the so-called claim to homogeneity and understands the history of such a claim, it doth not make any sense whatsoever. Because, to be entirely honest, there are different ethnic and racial groups in Japan. Different features among the different peoples, whether you're talking about Ainu or Okinawan peoples, and different other different groups in Japan. It is such a lie when you hear, oh, Japan is a homogeneous society. Or you hear, oh, Russia is a homogeneous population. They've never seen people of darker skin shades before. They have Romani, that is to say gypsies in Russia. In Ukraine. Who have skin as dark as Indian people from India. Or they have Turkic peoples, Middle Eastern people who are related to Middle Eastern groups of people. So no, Japan is not a homogeneous population. Every population, for the most part, has its dominant ethnic and racial group. However, to say that Japan is homogeneous, that make very little sense at all. So it is always interesting when I read that. So this person who wrote the article knew full well, that is a fallacy. That people who believe in ethnostates, so to speak, sort of ethnically isolated states or nations really believe in. They believe in the idea of the homogeneous population, but it is nearly unfathomable, if not just not a reality at all, in nearly any developed country. It is not true. Especially after World War II, when Japan had invaded so many countries in Asia, nearly all of Asia. Almost. They invaded so many countries in Asia, Japan did during World War II. So, I mean, that's very interesting. So no, I do not agree, and many people do not agree that Japan is a homogeneous population. They have had contact with other different nations. I mean, they're, especially in the Western world, since the 1600s, and a little earlier than that, not to mention that they've had contact and interchange, social exchange with China, trade with Korea and other Asian nations. So it is not a homogeneous population. There really is no such thing. And considering the similarity in the races, all of them, of course, Ainu people do look distinctly different. You could have and it is in some cases true, some people have Filipino or Korean people in their family, and they look just like any other Japanese person. It's the same thing is true here in the United States. Where there are Euro-Americans who have Afro-American blood, or even Afro-slave blood in their ancestry, and yet for the most part those people look just like any other Euro-American person, any European. So very interesting. So apparently he thinks that this so-called homogeneous population, it is an advantage. The prevalent belief in Japan has been that racism is something that Japan has been free of. Racism is something that you find in America and Europe. Oh yes, we find that in those uncivilized countries, those Western barbarians, they have racism, which is quite ridiculous. Anyone who has much in the way of sensibility or much understanding about the issues regarding Japanese culture already knoweth that Ainu people have been discriminated against. Okinawan people have been discriminated against. There is heavy discrimination against Koreans. It is so prevalent in Japan that many Japanese people do not even seem to consider that to be a problem. It is just something that, as far as many of those people are concerned, it would seem, it is just so prevalent that it is almost acceptable by the standard of many, it would seem. So Discrimination against Koreans is racism. Discrimination against Ainu people is racism. And even Okinawans. Because they are all different, they all have their own different features. And they're different groups. They are not like what is considered to be your typical Yamato Japanese person who is considered to be superior to other races by the understanding of Shinto nationalism, this understanding that Japanese people, the Yamato Japanese people, are descended from the gods, but that doth not extend to Ainu or the Okinawans who were discriminated against, those people, among other groups such as the Koreans who live in Japan and who are racially Korean. That is not something that is at all respected. The superior race is the Yamato Japanese person. By the sort of Shinto definition, this is sort of part of that religion. It is a nationalistic religion, which personally, in my opinion, the Shinto religion took a lot from Ainu religion and was just simply developed as a sort of religion for the conquering Yamato Japanese people. A lot of the same concepts in Shinto are present in Ainu religion in regard to different spirits and the worship of different spirits and appeasing different spirits. Very interesting. Not to say that many of those religions do not exist, animistic religions, worshiping different spirits. But interesting. I could talk more about that. Okay, a 1990 New York Times headline captioned "Racial slur by Japanese aide rekindles anger." According to the article, the then Japanese minister Seiroku Kajiyama was monitoring a Tokyo police raid that ended with the arrest of foreign women charged with sex solicitation. For some reason, I will admit I often do forget the meanings of words. So most of the time I do have to refer to a dictionary. Act of asking someone for money, help, or support. And I sort of knew the definition, but at the same time, I sort of forget things, and I do not think of it in an accurate way. I use dictionaries so much. Okay. Kajiyama, while comparing blacks to foreign prostitutes, let me see, evoked white flight. Oh goodness. It's like in America when neighborhoods become mixed because blacks move in and whites are forced out. They ruin the atmosphere, he said. The funny thing is, and I might as well address the elephant in the room, so to speak. Some of you, peradventure, know this. There are a lot of Japanese people who consider themselves to be on par with Euro people. Basically on par with white people. A lot of these people think that they are white in some way, and that the designation as honorary Aryan was not forgotten by many Japanese people. It permeated the culture culturally. Germany had considered Japanese people to be honorary Aryans. In other words, they were on par with them. And so there are a lot of, in Japanese culture, there are Japanese people who think that they are better than Afro people. And they think we, just like Europeans, are better than darker skinned people. That is a prevalent sentiment. In Japan, skin whitening is very popular. Now, guru culture, whatever you call it, the Gao culture, so to speak, where the women had this really popular culture where they were getting tans and they were trying to look dark. Some people really hated it. Even if you look on YouTube for some videos about that culture, there were people who were showing outright discrimination against those women. And they would attack them in the street even, because this was considered to be something lowly. If you have a tan, if you're not pretty and what they considered pale-skinned or white, let me be honest, no Japanese person has white skin. None of them do. If a person really wanteth to understand what we consider white skin to be, or rather European skin. European skin is different than Asian skin. European skin is different than Afro skin. In that the difference lieth in the fact that European skin sunburns. Japanese people do not sunburn. They tan very well. When they go out and stay in the sunlight for a while, they will tan, and their skin will be a yellowish complexion, and even sort of a tan or even golden complexion. Alright? And yet, Japanese women especially, they spend so much money on products trying to make themselves look as white, as pale, as fair-skinned as possible, so to speak. And so, being dark is considered to be lowly. It is not something that, as some people say, oh, this came from white supremacy. No. No, not at all. What it comes from, it is a very old thing. In many cultures throughout the world, white was considered to be it was what they preferred. And so you see that in the beauty culture. You see that even in the geisha culture. If you have ever seen a geisha, they paint their skin white. And for some strange reason, they also paint their teeth black. Somehow they have some type of substance they make their teeth black. Very weird. That seemeth to look somewhat like a demon to me, but hey, to them it is very, very attractive. For some reason, black teeth, skin painted white. I do not understand it, but apparently that was considered to be very beautiful. And so there were a lot of women who wanted to aspire to the beauty standard of a geisha. Right? That is a very interesting culture. So there are a lot of people, they put undue blame on Europeans, and they say, oh, Europeans were the ones who established this sort of culture of, oh, pale skin is beautiful. No. That preceded any introduction by Europeans. This has always been the standard in a great many countries. In India, you had the Aryans from the north, and the Dravidians, or whatever they are called in the south, who were darker skinned people. The northerners happened to have paler skin, and so pale skin was, the people who had more power had pale skin. And so that was the understanding. These people are beautiful. Darker skinned people are less, they're ugly, they lost. They lost power. The Aryans had taken control, and so there's a power dynamic, there's a cultural dynamic, there's a racial dynamic. but it cannot be entirely, and it hath nothing to do with Europeans. There are a lot of different groups of people who discriminate and showed prejudice due to different colors, even within their own countries. So Japan certainly doth have racism, and a great deal of it, and it was present in Japan before Europeans had even set foot upon Japanese soil. Racism against Koreans is well documented. A desire to conquer that land and to basically put those people under subjection, the sort of understanding that Japanese people were superior to Chinese people. And that is not to say that these types of beliefs are not present in nearly every country, and even the establishment and the fictional things that we call nations. But nonetheless, it is interesting to address this particular subject in history and culture, because there are some people who really do believe. They think, oh, Japanese culture seemeth to be ideal. I really do like it. So many people will say, I really do like the media. I really do like Japanese culture in general. It seemeth to be so much more interesting than American culture or European culture. A video like this, in my opinion, is important because it shows that Japan is not perfect. And as a person who aspires towards the heavenly and not the worldly, I really think that is good to show the cultural imperfections that we will doubtlessly come into contact with in this world. Because this world has problems, and no nation is perfect. There hath never been a perfect nation. All nations fall, and all nations have, anything worldly hath its problems. I'm trying to use the suffix th, because I like to practice early modern English grammar. I am sorry if that seemeth to be somewhat pretentious, but nonetheless I have to practice while I can. So I figure while I'm making videos, I might as well. Anyhow, we have this individual saying that when the blacks move in, they ruin the atmosphere. That is incredible, because apparently he knoweth something about that, even though he doth not live in the United States. But how very interesting. Okay. It's widely reported LDP policy chief Michio Watanabe famously blurted, "Japanese people take bankruptcy very seriously. But in America, where the use of credit cards is common, many blacks file bankruptcy and just laugh it off, thinking they no longer have to pay anything at all from the next day. They're so casual about it." The disparaging remarks ignited the National Urban League and Congressional Black Caucus to threaten a boycott against Japanese products. It also resulted in several demonstrations by members of Japan's Black ethnic Korean and Burakumin. Now this is a community I have never heard of before. How very interesting. There are so many different ethnic groups that live in Japan. Maybe I can figure out what this is. Alright, Burakumin. But we just read that Japan is a supposed homogenous society, and many Japanese people say it. Oh, Japan is a homogenous society. We have never seen anyone different than Yamato Japanese people, as if they have never seen a Korean before. We're talking about Burakumin, Hamlet people. How very interesting. So let me read this. Japanese minority group that suffers discrimination based on its historical outcast status. In the late 16th century, when Toyotomi Hideyoshi divided the populace into four social classes, one group remained outside and beneath the system. Those whose occupation involved the taking of life, such as butchers or executioners, or handling flesh or dead bodies, such as leather workers or grave diggers. Buddhist and Shinto beliefs in the polluting nature of these occupations have long stigmatized those who held them. Now, this is an ethnic group and not a racial group, however, and of course, that is very interesting. But truth be told, in regard to race, oftentimes, many of the people on the lower classes of society have darker skin. There are differences in skin tone in Japan. Not everyone is particularly pale. There are darker skinned people there as well. And all of these groups seem to have different features. So there are ethnic groups, but there are also groups that have a sort of racial and ethnic division. So that seemeth to be somewhat like the caste system in India. It is very interesting to read about these particular, Asian societies, civilizations. It is not something that we see very often, or read about very often, that is to say. So their outcast status was removed by law in 1871. Prejudice remains, and Burakumin heritage often stands in the way of marriages and employment opportunities. Burakumin are numbered to be 1 to 3 million. That is quite a lot of people for an ethnic group, to be honest. So in regard to Buddhism, especially Buddhism, and to Hinduism as well, so many of these Asian religions, if you were, and even in Europe, especially executioners were not treated well. So these are some particularly bad things culturally, because just by doing a particularly vital profession, you are discriminated against. Very interesting. Okay, which included a march on the Justice Ministry and a 24-hour sit-in Ginza's Tsukuyabashi Park. Now, the protests of these people about humanitarian matters and many things having to do with sort of the acknowledgement of different racial groups and ethnic groups in Japan, it is so much more substantial than the weird little neo-Nazi groups that are present in Japan. They also do protests, but they're quite... They do not have very much reach in regard to just their reach to the everyday person. So, which in a sense showeth that a lot of these ideas, especially having to do with race, are not based on anything other than this idea that Japanese people are Euro or white, so to speak. This idea is gradually, it is losing strength. There are a lot of Asian people here in the United States who think the same thing. They think I'm on par with Euro Americans, and when they face some discrimination or some different treatment, they start to realize, oh, I'm not white. Hey, I'm one of you. No, you are not. You are not one of them. You are not white. But for Japanese people, a lot of them, they use skin whitening cream. They try to make themselves look as pale as possible, but there come a time when a good deal of people start to realize that they are not white, they're not Euro. I remember there was a story of a person I used to watch on YouTube. She was talking about how when she was in high school, I think it was some bullies, and I believe that she liveth in Sweden, as far as I know. And apparently some bullies had taken her shirt off, and they made fun of the fact that her nipples were brown and not pink. Alright? There is a difference between being what many people consider to be, for lack of a better word, white, even though, truth be told, there is no white person. I mean, white is what you see, this little arrow, and the top of the screen is white. But even these words, they're white. And this background is black. But the idea of white and black is a real fallacy. Really, it's just pale and dark. That is the gradation, that is the scale. But the idea, the very notions of racial white and racial black it is quite ridiculous. And it causes a great deal of confusion and strife and polarity within different communities, to be entirely honest. Really, we might as well call it what it is. It is just a preference for either pale or dark. And if you truly are pale, if you truly have that skin that is almost albino, especially albino people, they cannot even, and they are probably, they are. If you were to call anyone white, they are the closest to it, but even they are not the color white. They still do not approximate to it, but they have a lot of skin problems. So it is different skin. But even so, regardless of all of the obvious differences of the Japanese Yamato race, so to speak, Yamato is and we will talk more about Yamato. The Yamato is this Shinto concept of the spirit of Japan that every single racial Japanese person hath, who is of course not Ainu, Okinawan, or what have you. In other words, they are the master race in Japan, so to speak, the ideal. Yamato basically means the spirit of Japan. I missed that when I said means, and because I'm practicing early modern English. Meaneth. Okay, I'm trying to practice that ETH. Okay, as difficult as it is. I am also trying to use less contractions, but some of you already know that from some of the other videos that I have done. Strange topic, truth be told, but anyhow. So we have all of these particular ethnic and racial groups doing a protest because this person is literally, these Japanese officials are just, they really do take racial division seriously, and it seemeth that they really are racist, in my opinion, to be entirely honest. So this needs to be looked at, says Russell. As an anthropology professor at Gifu University, Russell continues to teach, frequently write, and publish. This year, he made his first TV appearance on NHK, addressing a controversial Black Lives Matter animation clip, and it was a very strange clip. I know which one he is talking about. It was a cartoon that made Afro-Americans look very brutish and brutal. That is not to say that I agree with Black Lives Matter as an organization. But I also do not agree with the Proud Boy organization or any of the more conservative groups. I do not like any of these particular groups. That said, not every person rioted or caused destruction, and so they did a racist caricature or a blue racist animation, so to speak. And it was racist in my opinion. A lot of people thought it was racist. And that is something that many of us should acknowledge. Racism can only be subjective to an extent. We are dealing with abstract concepts, so some people, peradventure, especially individuals of a more nationalistic variety in all likelihood, will peradventure take issue with my usage of the word racism. And so I have to remember to be very specific and say racist in my opinion. Even if I am reading an article where another person is expressing his own opinions, I still feel that I should do that. To be very, very clear and very honest and very straightforward. I am speaking subjectively. So, you may have a different opinion. So, let me continue. On the topic of race, Dr. Russell is one of Japan's most prominent scholars and is a leading figure within the island nation's black community. Many people may not realize that there is a good deal of Afro people in Japan. It's very interesting. Most of them are Afro-American, but there are also people from Africa even. Between the mid-1990s and excuse me, I did mess that up. Between the mid-1980s and early 90s. In the highly competitive global economic ring, Japan and America were in a bloody death match. Both countries were accusing each other of being biased against blacks to affect their own racial racial problems. While American journalists were pointing figures at the racial gaffes of Japanese politicians, the Japanese were pointing at Rodney King and anti-Japanese rhetoric. But herein lieth the oddity of all of this. Japan apparently, by many of their own people's estimates, is a homogenous country. There are not many Afro people there, so why are these Japanese politicians talking about Afro-Americans who live in America, places such as Chicago? This has nothing to do with most of those people. And in regard to Japan's economic success, many people say, oh, Japan was so powerful back then. And I think, well, not really, because truth be told, Japan was leashed militarily. Sure, they had great business success, but in regard to their military power, that was basically constrained since World War II. So, all of their success, Japan would have basically been at the mercy of China and North Korea without the intervention of the United States. So, people talk about how powerful Japan was becoming, yet they had a military base in their very own country. United States military base in their very own country. So, when you're militarily occupied, a country such as that is still a vassal state. They cannot, even today, they cannot develop their military in a way that they would like to. Many of the conservatives would like the Japanese military to be very powerful, but it is an impossibility because the United States, in a sense, has sort of leased Japan. And if Japan were ever to have any sort of military ambitions, it is certain they would face North Korea, they would face China, and Vietnam, and all of the countries that they had basically wronged during World War II. The first country they would be looking at is Japan. And in all likelihood, you would have an alliance. Japan would, for one thing, if they wanted to engage in military ambitions, they would literally have to build their military up and have to do it quickly. And that takes time. And China and many of the other countries in the region that had Japanese troops go into their countries during World War II, in all likelihood, they would not allow that to happen. They simply would not. And they would likely tell the United States, they would say, these Japanese really think they're going to build up their military and commit some actions against us. And they would tell the United States, you need to put your dog on the leash. And they would do it. I truly believe that. The amount of destruction that we are going to read about in the future, Japanese war crimes, Japanese conquest during World War II, it was quite significant. I would say it was as significant, if not more so, than Germany's conquest in Europe. Quite incredible. Okay, Americans and Japanese calling each other racist is like two prostitutes calling each other fornicators, Russell wrote in his 2015 essay, The Other as Racist. But I do disagree, because in a sense, Japan as a country has no reason to have blackface, especially today. A lot of people, even Afro-American individuals, seem to give Japan a good deal of leeway and a good deal of grace in terms of what is done there. But in terms of racism, I think it goeth beyond racism. I think it goeth to a bigotry that is deeper. And it has to do with the belief that fair skin, pale skin, is beautiful. And the dark skin is ugly. And even in India, the caste system in India, this goeth far deeper than what is considered to be white supremacy, because it is a well-known understanding that darker people are ugly. In Japan, in India, in the Philippines, many countries. Darker people are not considered to be beautiful people. For the most part, that is the Asian beauty standard. And you have in Korea, you have all sorts of Asian countries where skin bleaching and skin whitening is practiced routinely. And it is practiced to such an extent that most women do not feel comfortable without applying some type of skin whitening cosmetics or even, in some severe cases, bleaching. Not so much bleaching, because that is done for more darker skin tones and not so very often in Japan. Instead, in Japan, they have a huge variety of whitening products and creams and lotions, among many other things. Very interesting. Alright. After receiving his PhD, Dr. Russell came back to Japan and interviewed more than 100 black people from America, Canada, and Africa, while researching the country's historical, socio-economic hierarchy and Japan's marginalized black community. Russell's colleague invited him to a private upscale art show that featured the work of a white American photographer who took crime scene photos in front of images of abject poverty and murdered corpses, some of them black and brown. Russell, discussing his research with one of the attendees, pointed out that the exhibit contributed to the perpetual stereotypes that Japan had about blacks. The attendee, a publisher, suggested that Russell write a book which became Japanese views of blacks. The problem is not just Little Black Sambo. 1991. Written in Japanese, the book was a comprehensive study focusing on Japanese images of black people. The prevalent belief in Japan has been that racism is something that Japan has been free of. Racism is something that you find in America and Europe, but Japan just doesn't have the history and legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. That's not true, but that's the perception, was helped by the fact that racism in Japan tends to be viewed, as well as in America, as a black and white thing. Now, the interesting thing is, black and white, these very terms, they have nothing to do with reality. And I have started to recognize that, truth be told, racism as a terminology is not so very accurate to describe what happens worldwide. What happens worldwide, in my opinion, as I have seen it, has to do with pale and dark. One could even say it goeth all the way back to the Book of Enoch, in even the Curse of Canaan. But nonetheless, it is very interesting. But I have started to view these matters more aesthetically than I used to. Because when one looketh upon the very sort of the beauty standard of geishas in Japan and the beauty standards of the women, the idea as a Japanese man, even in early Japan, when Europeans had not even come to Japan, the idea is you want a snow white, beautiful woman. You want a woman whose skin is as white as snow. You know, this idea of a woman whose skin is as white as porcelain. One will not find an Asian that looketh like that, because Asian people tan so well that they may look pale skinned without sunlight in the wintertime, or if they just go inside and just simply stay in houses or buildings for long periods of time and do not expose themselves to sunlight. However, when they do have adequate sunlight, as every healthy person should, these people look yellow and even tan. So, I no longer sort of subscribe to the view that this is something necessarily that I think, in my opinion, it is racism, but racism itself, in my opinion, nationalistic or otherwise, I think the more pertinent question has to do with the sort of conception of beauty. I've started to notice, and many people are talking about the term colorism, because truth be told, that is what it seemeth to be, but it all has to do with preference, to be honest. It is very interesting. And many people who are darker, they begin to hate themselves, and they think they have to make their skin whiter with whitening creams. And Japan is one of those countries where a lot of these people who perceive themselves to be ugly, unless they look pale, they apply a lot of these Korean and Japanese creams to their skin, and we will be covering this on my channel. Skin whitening in all of its forms. Because it is something that is being heavily discussed in the Afro-American community, or at least on YouTube. A lot of Afro-American YouTubers are discussing it, and I will join them as well. Because it is an interesting subject that not too many people know about. Anyhow, let me continue reading. Japan's racism isn't necessarily only directed at Afro people. It is also directed at other Asians, he saith. Though Japan's curated image is of a homogeneous nation, groups like the Ainu, Burakumen, ethnic Koreans and Chinese, and Okinawans are excluded. It is hard to distinguish them from majority Japanese, Yamato Japanese, so to speak, descendants of the gods and goddess Amaterasu, so to speak. So that kind of feeds into this myth that Japan is monolithic, it is monocultural, monoracial, and therefore it lacks minorities. Saith Russell, the discrimination that these groups face is comparable to blacks in America, a point that was raised by the poet Langston Hughes in the 1930s when he visited Japan. Hughes noting the press treatment of Koreans made it analogous to the treatment of Afro people in the American press. By aligning American slavery with Japan's 30-year-old occupation, Russell exposeth the parallels between the two countries. One of the things that I think uniteth racisms is that there is a history of exploitation and subjugation, he saith. Very interesting. But if anyone saith to you, oh, such and such country is homogeneous, that is any developed country, just about every developed country has some different ethnic groups, and even developing countries, if the country has any size to it, there are different racial groups, different ethnic groups, different features among the peoples, different body physiological characteristics in different groups. And so, if anyone saith that to you, then you know that those people are not speaking truth, because it has basically been disproven in so many ways. Just as blacks were enslaved in the States, Koreans became wartime laborers. Just as black women were raped, tortured, and subjugated to unethical medical experiments, the Japanese Imperial Army forced some Korean women to work in wartime brothels against their will, later to be known as comfort women. That is a subject that I've talked about before. But not to a very large extent. I am going to do more videos about comfort women. I really will be doing more. Because Korea was colonized, there's a sense of superiority the Japanese feel towards Koreans and ethnic Koreans. And the interesting idea about the colonization of Korea is that this was talked about so hundreds of years before. Even from ancient Japanese records, where Japanese people have always had this idea one day they would invade Korea and take that country over. And this was considered to sort of be a sort of destiny that they believed would occur, and that they believed their goddess Amaterasu would lead them to victory over Korea. It would be theirs. They would have control over it. They would subjugate the people in that land. This was talked about for so many years, and as far as I know, they had tried to, before World War II, take over Korea once before, but they did not succeed. But it is considered to be, in a sense, the birthright of the Japanese, especially people who know more or less of the Shinto gods in history. There are particular things in the Shinto religion that sort of hold that idea of invading and taking that country of Korea as their own, as part, and basically annexing it or colonizing it and making it part of Japan. It is weird, but I have read many books about the subject. So that carries over into how Japanese perceived black folks who were also a subjugated people, saith Russell. Asked if Japan's Black Lives Matter protests are an imported American trend that people mimicked, Russell saith, I think many of Japanese demonstrators are motivated by real concerns about not only racism in America, but also manifestations of racism in Japan. You see this in social media, which is also a haven for hate speech. But you also see pushback against that, and it's coming from other Japanese. Russell hath lived in Japan for the past 30 years to bridge the artificial boundaries that separated Asian, black, and American studies. As a black anthropologist has been, as he saith, lonely. Now he encountereth a plethora of students, teachers, writers, and activists that he has undoubtedly taught and inspired. How very interesting. Now, the interesting thing about the internet is that oftentimes people will say what they feel in their heart on the internet that they will not say directly to people's faces. Of course, many of us already know this. There are many people like that. And that is especially true against many bigoted peoples. In my opinion, and based on what I have seen, since George Floyd's murder in 2020 at the hands of white police officers in Minnesota. Now, I have heard so many people, because I often frequent the especially conservative places on the internet. Conservative YouTubers, for instance. I've seen many people, they said, George Floyd deserved to die. And I just think, how can that be in any way something respectable to say? Regardless of what anyone think of the man and what crimes he had committed, that showeth a good deal of hatred for an individual. And for what reason? We can only speculate. I have seen that quite a lot among people who I myself even had respect for. Some individuals would say, oh, this is something he deserved. And I think a police officer has basically breached protocol and essentially killed a man. He could be alive, but the police officer, because of his malpractice in putting his knee upon a man's neck, even when people had said that it was killing him, continued to do so. So regardless, it is very interesting. There are a lot of people, especially on the internet, and even people who are well-known conservatives, who had said such very, I don't really even have words for that statement, because that statement maketh very little sense. If those individuals were under custody, they would not like to die at the hands of a police officer during arrest or any other type of procedure. They would like to be treated with the fairness and justice expected of law enforcement officers, and anyone else for that matter. Okay, in Tokyo and Osaka, participants have been in the thousands. In rural towns where they lack the numbers, their passion made up the difference. Western media characterizes Japan's protests as a form of solidarity with the U.S., not as a direct response to Japan's own racial problems. Professor Russell, commenting on the mass of Japanese people protesting, says, I don't think they get enough credit. That is all very interesting. We will be talking about skin whitening. We will be talking about different things having to do with skin color, race, all types of things. I do know this man. Everyone has some degree of bias. I think I will be reading more articles by him and reviewing more content by him, because he does deal with a lot of the things that are occurring in Japan, which is somewhat interesting. Anyhow, this has been part of a new sort of, this isn't necessarily new. These are all podcasts. It's just I read about different things, and whatnot, and give commentary on it. Anyhow, may you be blessed and farewell.